Part 1, the beginning of Luca's journey. Luca, a 25-year-old young man from Florence, had always been passionate about learning languages. Since school, English had been one of his favorite subjects, but he never felt confident speaking it. Whenever he watched English movies, he dreamed of speaking like a native. However, there was a big problem. No one around him spoke English. His parents were Italian, his friends were Italian, and even at work, all conversations were in Italian. He tried to read English online and watch movies in the original language, but something was always missing: real experience. One day he decided he had to make a change in his life. He told himself, "If I really want to learn English, I must put myself in an English-speaking environment." He started searching for ways to travel to an English-speaking country. At first he thought about the US, but the cost of living and travel was too high. Then he considered Canada and Australia, but in the end he chose London. London is close, its culture is interesting, and I love the British accent. He bought a plane ticket, packed his suitcase, and prepared for the longest journey of his life. His family was a bit worried, but they supported his decision. As the plane took off from Florence, he looked down from the window. A mix of excitement and anxiety filled him. Could he live in London? Could he talk to people? After a 2-hour flight, London finally appeared beneath him. Part 2, the first real conversation. The plane landed smoothly on the runway at Heathrow Airport. Luca, still excited and a little nervous, unfastened his seatbelt and took a deep breath. He looked out the window. The sky was cloudy, light rain was falling, and the runway glowed under the yellow airport lights. "All right, I'm here. Now the real adventure begins." As he stepped off the plane, a cool breeze touched his face. Walking towards passport control, he felt his heart beating faster. He had imagined this moment many times, but now that he was really in London, it felt much more real. There was a long queue at the passport control gates. As he stood in line, he looked around. People were speaking different languages, some rushing, some looking as excited as he was. Finally, it was his turn. A middle-aged officer in a blue uniform looked at him and said, "Passport, please." Luca quickly took his passport out of his bag and handed it over. The officer checked his visa page and asked, "What is the purpose of your visit?" Luca's heart raced. This was his first real conversation in English. He had practiced this question in his mind many times, but now that he had to answer, he felt like his tongue was stuck. No, this was exactly why he had come to London: to speak. He smiled and said calmly, "I am here to improve my English and explore the city." The officer nodded and continued, "How long will you stay?" "About 3 months." The officer glanced at his computer screen, stamped the passport, and said in an official but friendly tone, "Enjoy your stay in London." Luca took back his passport and walked through the gate with a smile. He had done it, his first conversation in English, and he understood the questions well. As he entered the main airport hall, everything felt fresh and exciting. The sound of flight announcements, people hurrying with their luggage, the smell of fresh coffee from airport cafes. He grabbed his suitcase and stepped outside. London's air was colder than Florence's, but he didn't care. His adventure had officially begun. Now the next step: finding his new home. Part 3, New Residence. As Luca stepped out of the airport, he felt a strange sensation. "I'm really in London now." He looked around. The famous black taxis, the red double-decker buses, and people rushing along the sidewalks. Before his trip, he had rented a room in a shared apartment through the internet. The landlord, Mr. Walters, was a British man who had seemed very kind in his emails. Luca checked the address on his phone, and decided to take a taxi. The taxi driver was a man in his 50s with a thick British accent. Luca said politely, "Hello, I need to go to this address, please." The driver glanced at the address and said, "All right, mate, hop in." Luca got in and the taxi started moving through the rainy streets of London. He gazed out the window, brick buildings, street signs, small shops, and people walking past each other with umbrellas. Everything looks just like in the movies. After about 30 minutes, the taxi stopped in front of an old but beautiful building. Luca paid the fare and got out. The building was 3 stories high, with a doorbell labeled W. Walters. He pressed the button. A few seconds later, the door opened and a tall man with grayish hair and a neat outfit appeared. He smiled and said, "Hello, you must be Luca." Luca smiled back and replied, "Yes, nice to meet you, Mr. Walters. Nice to meet you too. Come in, let me show you your room." They stepped inside. The house felt warm and cozy. Mr. Walters pointed to a hallway and said, "Your room is upstairs. Follow me." Luca walked up the stairs and entered his room. It was small but comfortable, a bed, a study desk, a wardrobe, and a window overlooking the street. He placed his suitcase on the floor and looked outside. "Welcome to your new home," Mr. Walters said. "If you need anything, just ask me." "Thank you very much," Luca replied with a smile. When Mr. Walters left, Luca sat on the bed. His life in London had officially begun. He didn't know what challenges awaited him, but one thing was certain: the real adventure had just begun. Part 4. The first day in the city. The next morning, Luca woke up early. He looked out the window. The sky was cloudy, and the weather was a bit colder than he had expected. However, he was full of energy. Today was the day he was going, to take his first steps in London and find his way around this big city. He walked out of the house and headed toward the nearest bus station. The sound of his footsteps echoed on the cobblestone street, and the cool air brushed against his face. When he reached the station, he noticed a few other people waiting for the bus. Luca looked around and decided to travel the traditional way, by bus. "This is the best way to see the city," he thought. A few minutes later, the bus arrived. He quickly bought a ticket and found a spot in the middle of the bus. Moments later, the bus started moving, and Luca gazed out the window. "This city is truly amazing," he thought. The streets were full of life, colorful shops, cafes with customers sipping coffee, and people walking or chatting. Along every street, old and new buildings blended together. He arrived at the next station and got off the bus. At the station, an older woman looked at him with a smile and said, "You look lost. Are you new here?" Luca was a bit confused, but he answered, "Yes, I'm new. I just arrived yesterday." The woman smiled and said, "Well, welcome to London. Don't worry, you'll get used to it. Just make sure to keep an eye out on the buses. They can be tricky at first." Luca thanked her. "Thank you, I will." The woman walked away slowly, and Luca continued on his way. This was his first real conversation with a stranger, and the experience was very exciting for him. As he walked, he noticed that the English on the streets of London was very different from what he had heard in class or in movies. The accents and local expressions were new and fascinating to him. He stepped into one of the cafes to grab some coffee. "My first coffee in London," he thought. When he told the barista he wanted a coffee, the barista smiled and said, "Is it your first time in London?" "Yes," Luca replied. "I'm here to improve my English." "That's great. London's the best place to do it." After he got his coffee, Luca walked slowly out of the cafe. Well, today was a good start. Part 5. New Challenges. The first few days for Luca in London were exciting and different, but over time he realized that learning a language and living in a new country were as challenging as they were fascinating. His first problem was the cultural differences. Every day as he walked out of the house, he noticed new behaviors. At bus stations, people usually got on quickly and quietly, and not many looked at each other. This was quite different from Florence, where people always made eye contact and chatted with each other. At work, things were also a bit different. His colleagues were mostly speaking in English, but the accents made some conversations a bit hard for Luca, especially when one of his co-workers, Jane, spoke with a thick Scottish accent. Luca tried his best to pay attention to her words, but some of the words were completely unintelligible. One day, his co-worker Jane invited him for an afternoon tea. This was a great opportunity for Luca to learn more about the English language and culture. As they walked into the cafe, Jane smiled and asked, "Do you prefer tea or coffee?" Luca paused for a moment and replied, "I think I'll try tea." Jane smiled and said, "Good choice. Tea is the British way." This conversation helped Luca learn more about British customs and expressions. After they drank their tea, Luca asked Jane, "Do you have any tips for learning English more easily?" Jane thought for a moment and said, "Well, it's all about practice. The more you speak, the better you get. And don't be afraid to make mistakes. Everyone does." "That's good advice," Luca said, and he really appreciated that tip. Over the weeks, he realized that making mistakes was a natural part of language learning. Every time he made a mistake, he would laugh and try to correct it. Over time, he gained more confidence and was able to hold longer conversations with his colleagues. Learning English is a journey, not a destination, he told himself, and I'm just getting started. Part 6. Discover London. One Saturday, Luca decided to take a break from the hustle and bustle of work and daily life to explore more of London. He had planned to visit some of the famous landmarks and get closer to the culture of the city. His first stop was the Tower of London. As soon as he entered the tower, he felt like he had stepped back in time. The Tower of London, with its tall walls and ancient towers, was a symbol of power and history in England. Luca took a guided tour around the tower and heard fascinating details about its history. He enjoyed seeing the crown jewels and hearing stories about the reigns of past queens and kings. In one of the galleries, Luca met another tourist. He was a man from Germany who had come to London to learn English. "Hello?" the German man said. "I'm from Germany. How about you?" "I'm from Italy, from Florence," Luca replied. "Nice to meet you. What brought you to London?" "I came to improve my English," Luca said. "What about you?" "Same here. I've been here for a month, and it's amazing but also challenging." The German man told Luca that at first it had been difficult for him to communicate with the people of London, but over time he had become more comfortable. He suggested that Luca join other tours in London to interact more with the locals. After visiting the tower, Luca headed to Hyde Park. This large and beautiful park was a peaceful escape in the heart of the busy city. Luca sat by a lake in the park and watched the birds. Living in London is truly a unique experience, Luca thought. Everything here feels different, but every day I spend here, I enjoy this city and its people more. Part 7. An unexpected event. One afternoon, Luca decided to visit one of the famous cafes in London to read a few pages of his language book while sipping coffee. He went to a small cafe in the Notting Hill neighborhood. The atmosphere of the Boint Cafe was very cozy. The walls were covered with paintings and old photos, and soft, mellow music played in the background. Luca sat in a corner and began reading his book. A few minutes later, one of the customers, who seemed to be from London, approached him and smiled. "Hi, I couldn't help but notice your book. Are you studying English?" Luca looked up in surprise. Yes, I am, he replied. I'm trying to improve my English. The man smiled and said, That's great. What's your name? I'm Luca from Italy. Nice to meet you, Luca. I'm James. I'm a writer and I teach English. If you'd like, I could help you practice a bit. Luca hesitated for a moment, wondering if he should accept the offer. But after a few seconds of thinking, he decided not to miss the opportunity. That would be wonderful, Luca said. James began talking with Luca and gave him tips on grammar and pronunciation. He also suggested ways to improve Luca's speaking skills. One important thing, James said, is to not be afraid of making mistakes. When you make mistakes, you learn. And in English, we use a lot of phrasal verbs. They can be tricky at first, but once you get the hang of them, you'll sound more natural. Luca listened carefully to his advice and felt that he was gradually gaining a better understanding of the language. This brief meeting with James was very helpful for Luca and gave him a new sense of motivation. I'm glad I came here today, Luca thought. This city and its people are full of surprises. Part 8. Larger Challenges. Weeks passed in London, and Luca gradually felt that he was getting used to the city. However, there were still many challenges. One of his biggest challenges was dealing with more complicated and faster conversations that he encountered at work and on the streets with people. One day at work, when Luca was talking to one of his colleagues named Helen, he realized he couldn't keep up with the speed at which she was speaking. Sorry, could you repeat that? Luca said in surprise. Helen paused for a moment and then said, Oh, I was just saying that we have a meeting at 3 p.m. today. You should be ready for it. Luca thought to himself. Sometimes when the speaking speed is fast, it's hard to catch everything. He decided that to improve his ability to understand faster conversations, he would listen to more English podcasts and watch more movies. However, he still felt that in everyday conversations with native speakers, he sometimes couldn't fully understand everything. One day, while Luca was walking down the streets of London, he encountered a shopkeeper in a small store. The shopkeeper, a man with a distinct London accent, made it even harder for Luca to understand what he was saying. Would you like to try this coat on? The shopkeeper asked with a heavy accent. Luca was a bit confused and replied, Sorry, could you repeat that? The shopkeeper asked again this time, emphasizing the words a bit more. Would you like to try this coat on? Luca smiled after hearing the sentence again and said, Yes, I would like to try it on. This experience was very educational for Luca, because he realized that in real life, the speed of conversations and different accents could make language learning more difficult. But he was still determined to face every challenge. I will keep trying, Luca told himself. I will improve no matter how hard it is. Part 9. Growth and Confidence. Days and weeks passed, and Luca was gaining more and more fluency in English. He had realized that he no longer feared speaking. When he interacted with people on the street or at work, he didn't worry about making mistakes or using the wrong words. He spoke with much more confidence now, and he could feel the big change. One afternoon, Luca was sitting in a cafe, writing a few sentences in English when an older lady approached him and smiled. Excuse me, I couldn't help but notice you're writing in English. Are you from London? Luca smiled and replied, No, I'm from Italy. I'm living here to improve my English. The lady looked at him carefully and said, Well, I must say, your English is very good. You've made a lot of progress. Luca responded with joy. Thank you. I've been working hard on it. The lady continued, I can tell. Don't be afraid to speak more. The more you practice, the better you'll become. You've got the confidence now. Just keep using it. Her words had a great impact on Luca. He had never felt so confident up until that moment. This conversation reminded him never to give up on trying. In the following days, Luca spoke even more with native English speakers. He took every opportunity to meet people and worked on improving his listening and speaking skills. With every new conversation, he felt he was better and better. "I'm getting there," Luca told himself. "I'm not perfect yet, but I'm improving every day." He no longer saw language learning just as a task, but as an opportunity to connect with the people of London and understand different cultures. Part 10. New Beginning. Luca had reached a point where he felt that English was no longer a big challenge for him. He could easily speak with people in various environments and could clearly see the positive changes in himself. But even though he had reached a considerable level of fluency, he knew that language learning was an endless journey. One day in Hyde Park, London, Luca was sitting and chatting with one of his new friends, Sophie, who was a native English speaker. Sophie said to him, "Luca, you've come so far. When you first arrived, you were so shy. Now you're speaking like a local." Luca smiled and replied, "It wasn't easy, but I'm glad I stuck with it." Sophie smiled and said, "That's the key. It's all about persistence. The more you practice, the more natural it becomes." Luca thought back to the days when he was afraid of simple conversations and smiled at the memory of the first time he spoke in English. Today, he not only had mastered the language, but also had a deeper understanding of British culture. He had been able to connect with native English speakers and used every conversation and opportunity to learn more. "I'm ready for the next challenge," Luca told himself. "Learning a language is just the beginning. Now it's time to explore the world even more." He decided that from then on he would travel more, explore new cultures, and continue learning other languages. He knew that language learning never really ends, and that every day was a new opportunity for learning and growth. Luca had fallen in love with London. This city had not only become his new home, but it was also the place where he had grown as an individual, traveling the world of languages and cultures. "This is just the beginning," Luca said to himself as he looked up at the cloudy London sky, thinking about a brighter future ahead.